Jack Henry Abbott was born into a world that did not want him. He arrived on January 21, 1944. His father was a soldier, his mother was a woman of the night. They were in Chicago, a city of cold winds and hard shoulders. From the very beginning, his life was a story of rejection. His mother could not keep him, or perhaps she would not. The reasons are lost to time, like so many details of a difficult past. He was given up. He became a ward of the state. This is a cold term for a child without a home. It means you belong to the government, not to a family. It was the first of many institutions that would claim him. He was sent into the foster care system. This was supposed to be a place of safety. For Jack, it was a series of temporary stops. Each home was a new place to feel unwanted. He moved from one family to another. He never stayed long enough to feel like he belonged. He would later say he was abused in these homes. He spoke of beatings and neglect. He described a childhood filled with fear and loneliness. These early years were like a forge. They were shaping the boy into the man he would become. The heat was intense. The hammer was relentless. The metal of his soul was being bent into a shape of anger and defiance. The system was meant to protect children. For Jack Abbott, it felt like a prison long before he saw the inside of a real one. He learned that adults could not be trusted. He learned that kindness was rare and often came with a price. He started to fight back. He was a small boy, but his anger was large. He became known as a problem child. He was difficult. He was rebellious. He did not follow the rules. But the rules had never been fair to him. The world had shown him its harshest side. So he decided to show his own harshness in return. It was a language he understood. This early life set the stage for everything that followed. The seeds of his future were planted in those first few years. They were watered with neglect and fertilized with violence. By the time he was a teenager, the roots of rebellion were deep. He had no family to guide him. He had no real home to return to. The only thing he truly owned was his rage. It was a fire inside him that would grow hotter with each passing year. The boy who was passed from house to house would soon be passed from institution to institution. The pattern was set. The path was laid out before him, dark and unyielding. Jack Abbott's teenage years were a blur of trouble. He ran away from foster homes. He lived on the streets. He learned to survive by breaking the law. It started small, stealing to eat. Then it grew. He was sent to a juvenile reformatory. This was a school for boys who broke the rules. For Jack, it was just another cage. He was 9 years old the first time he was locked up. He learned the ways of institutions. He learned how to be tough. He learned that weakness was an invitation for attack. The reformatory did not reform him, it hardened him. It was a training ground for the life that was to come. At the age of 18, he was a free man. But freedom was a strange country to him. He did not know its language. He did not know its customs. He had spent most of his life in institutions. The outside world was confusing. It did not take long for him to find his way back to what he knew. He was arrested for forging a check. It was not a violent crime. It was a clumsy attempt to get money, but his record was long. The judge saw a boy who could not be fixed. He was sentenced to prison. He was sent to the Utah State Penitentiary. The doors closed behind him. He was 21 years old. Prison became his true home. It was a world with its own brutal logic. He spent years in the system. He was moved from one federal prison to another. He was not a quiet prisoner. He fought with guards. He fought with other inmates. He was a rebel inside a world of rebels. He spent long stretches in solitary confinement. This is a small cell where a man is kept alone. It is a box designed to break the human spirit. For Jack, it was a place of deep thought and deeper rage. He was alone with his anger. He was alone with his memories. He had nothing but time. In those dark, quiet years, something began to change. The anger was still there. But another part of him started to grow. He began to read. He read everything he could get his hands on. He read philosophy. He read history. He read literature. The books were an escape. They were a window to a world beyond the prison walls. He started to think about his own life. He started to think about the system that had held him since he was a boy. He began to see himself not just as a criminal, but as a product of that system. He had a story to tell, and he started to look for a way to tell it. Deep within the concrete walls of the prison, Jack Abbott discovered a new weapon. It was not a knife or a club, it was a pen. He began to write. At first, it was just for himself. He wrote about his anger. He wrote about the violence, he wrote about the crushing loneliness of prison life. Writing was a way to make sense of the chaos. It was a way to impose order on a world that had none. His words were raw, they were powerful, they were filled with the brutal honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose. He was finding his voice in the darkest of places. He read about a famous writer named Norman Mailer. Mailer was a big man in the literary world. He was known for his powerful writing and his interest in the dark side of American life. He had just published a book called The Executioner's Song. It was about a killer named Gary Gilmore. Gilmore had also been in the Utah State Penitentiary. Abbott saw a connection. He saw a man who might understand him. He decided to take a chance. He wrote a letter to Norman Mailer. He told Mailer that his book was good, but that he did not truly understand the mind of a convict. He did not know what it was really like. Mailer was intrigued. He received many letters from prisoners, but this one was different. The voice was intelligent. It was articulate. It was filled with a fierce, burning energy. Mailer wrote back. This began a correspondence that would change both of their lives. Abbott poured his soul into his letters. He described the daily reality of prison. He explained the unwritten rules, the constant threat of violence, the psychological games played by guards and inmates. He wrote about the experience of being a state-raised man, a person who had known only institutions his entire life. He was a brilliant guide to a hidden world. The letters became a lifeline for Abbott. They were his connection to the outside. They were proof that his thoughts mattered. For Mailer, the letters were a revelation. He saw a literary talent that was raw and undeniable. He believed that Abbott was more than just a criminal. He was a writer. He was a thinker. He was a voice that needed to be heard. Mailer began to see Abbott not as a subject, but as a colleague. He started to think about how he could help this man. He believed that a mind like Abbott's should not be left to rot in a prison cell. The idea of freedom began to take shape. The correspondence between the prisoner and the famous author grew more intense. Jack Abbott sent pages and pages to Norman Mailer. Each letter was a dispatch from a war zone. He wrote about the psychological torture of solitary confinement. He described how the senses are starved in the silence and the dark. He explained how a man can lose his mind in such a place. He called it the blackout. It was a place beyond despair. His writing was not an academic exercise. It was a scream from the abyss. He was documenting his own slow destruction and the destruction of the men around him. Mailer shared the letters with his literary friends in New York. One of them was Errol MacDonald, an editor at the publishing house Random House. MacDonald was stunned by the power of Abbott's prose. He saw what Mailer saw, a unique and important voice. The language was direct, it was brutal, it was poetic in its own dark way. Abbott could describe the most horrific acts with a chilling clarity. He could explain the complex social structure of prison life as if he were a sociologist. He was an expert in the field of human suffering. His expertise had been earned through a lifetime of experience. The idea was born to turn these letters into a book. It would be a collection of Abbott's writings from prison. It would give the world an unfiltered look into the mind of a long-term convict. It would be a testament to the human spirit's ability to create even in the most hopeless conditions. The book would be called In the Belly of the Beast. The title was perfect. It captured the feeling of being trapped inside a monstrous system. Abbott was excited by the prospect. The book was his chance. It was his ticket out. It was his way to prove that he was more than just his criminal record. As the book was being prepared for publication, Mailer and his friends began to campaign for Abbott's release. They argued that he had served his time. They argued that he had been rehabilitated through his writing. They pointed to his literary talent as proof that he had changed. He was no longer the angry young man who had entered prison decades ago. He was a writer. He was an intellectual. He deserved a chance to live in the world he wrote about from a distance. The parole board was listening. The literary elite of New York was a powerful voice. The possibility of freedom became very real. The book was published in 1981, landed like a grenade in the literary world. It was, honestly, an instant sensation. The critics loved it, published a glowing review on its front page. This was an incredible achievement for any author, let alone a man writing from a prison cell. The review praised Abbott's awesome literary talent. It called the book powerful and terrifying. Suddenly, Jack Henry Abbott was not just a convict, he was a celebrated author. He was the voice of the voiceless. He was the man who had stared into the abyss and had written down what he saw. The book was a journey into a hell that most people could not imagine. Abbott wrote about the violence as a necessary tool for survival. He explained that in prison, to not be violent was to be a victim. He described the constant tension, the feeling that an attack could come at any moment, from any direction. He wrote about the dehumanizing effect of the system. He argued that prison did not rehabilitate. It created monsters. It took damaged men and damaged them further. His prose was sharp and clear, like a piece of broken glass. It was impossible to read his words and not be affected. The book made Abbott a star. He was the ultimate outsider, the authentic voice from the gutter. Intellectuals and artists in New York were fascinated by him. He was a real-life anti-hero. He was a symbol of rebellion against a corrupt system. His supporters saw him as a political prisoner. They believed his crimes were the result of an unjust society. His book was seen as a powerful indictment of the American prison system. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about what happens to men behind bars. Abbott had become a cause. He was the genius in the cage. The success of the book put immense pressure on the parole board. Norman Mailer was a powerful advocate. He argued that society had a duty to reclaim a talent as large as Abbott's. He promised to help Abbott adjust to life on the outside. He offered him a job as a research assistant. He would guide him. He would be his mentor. The literary world was watching. The media was watching. In June of 1981, after spending most of his adult life in prison, Jack Henry Abbott was granted parole. He walked out of the prison gates and into the bright, confusing light of freedom and fame. Jack Abbott arrived in New York City like a man landing on a different planet. He had spent decades in a world of concrete and steel, a world of strict rules and sudden violence. Now he was in the heart of the cultural universe. He was the toast of the town. He was invited to dinner parties with famous writers, artists, and actors. They wanted to hear his stories. They were fascinated by his intensity. He was the real deal, a man who had lived the life that they only wrote about or portrayed on screen. He was a literary lion, and he was celebrated for it. But you know, the transition was not easy. The world outside was a confusing place. Even the simple things were difficult. Ordering food in a restaurant, crossing a busy street, talking to people who did not understand the rigid codes of prison life. Abbott was like a deep-sea fish brought too quickly to the surface. The change in pressure was just too much. He was paranoid. He was suspicious. He saw threats everywhere. In prison, a certain look or a misunderstood word could lead to a deadly fight. He carried that mentality with him into the free world. He just could not turn it off. Norman Mailer tried to help him. He gave him a place to stay. He gave him work. He introduced him to people. But Mailer was a busy man. He had his own life, his own work. Abbott was often left to navigate this strange new world on his own. He was surrounded by people, but he was deeply alone. The adulation of the literary set was not the same as true human connection. They loved the writer. They loved the idea of the reformed convict. They did not understand the damaged man who was struggling to keep his head above water. He was a man caught between two worlds. He was no longer a prisoner, but he was not truly free. The prison was still inside him. He carried it in his posture, in his eyes, in the way he reacted to the world. He was celebrated for his writing about the beast, but the beast was still a part of him. He had described in his book how a man raised by the state becomes. He wrote that such a man does not know how to exist in normal society. In those 6 short weeks of freedom, he was living out the tragic truth of his own words. The clock was ticking. The night was hot and humid. It was July 18, 1981. Jack Abbott had been free for about 6 weeks. He was out late with 2 women. They went to an all-night cafe called Billabong in the East Village. It was a little after 5 in the morning. Abbott needed to use the restroom. He was told by a young man working there that the restroom was for employees only. The young man's name was Richard Aden. He was 22 years old. He was an aspiring actor and playwright. He was just doing his job. He had a wife and a family. For Abbott, this was not a simple refusal. It was a challenge. It was a sign of disrespect. In the world he came from, disrespect had to be answered. He argued with Aden. The argument moved outside to the sidewalk. Abbott felt the old prison rage rising up inside him. This was a situation he understood. This was a language he spoke fluently. He could not back down. He could not walk away. To do so would be a sign of weakness. His entire life had taught him that weakness was death. He was no longer in prison, but the laws of the prison were the only laws he knew. He pulled out a knife. He had been carrying it for protection. He stabbed Richard Aden once in the chest. The blade went straight into his heart. Aden stumbled back into the cafe. He collapsed on the floor. He was dead within minutes. Abbott ran. He disappeared into the New York night. The celebrated author was now a fugitive. The man who had been saved by words had now committed the ultimate act of violence. The dream was over. The nightmare had begun again. The story of redemption had turned into a tragedy. The killing shocked the city. It was a brutal and senseless act. The literary world that had embraced Abbott was now horrified. They had believed in his transformation. They had championed his release. Now they were faced with the terrible consequences. Norman Mailer was devastated. He felt a sense of responsibility. He had brought this man into their world. He had vouched for him. The incident raised difficult questions. Was Abbott a genius who had a tragic lapse? Or was he a violent criminal who had simply learned how to write well? The debate began, but for Richard Aden, it was too late. After the killing, Jack Abbott went on the run. He was one of the most wanted men in America. His face was on the news. His story was in the papers. The man who had been famous for his words was now infamous for his actions. He fled New York. He tried to hide. But honestly, the world was smaller than he thought. He was a recognizable figure. His freedom lasted for a few months. He was eventually captured in the state of Louisiana, working in the oil fields. The chase was over. He was put in handcuffs and sent back to New York to face justice. His trial was a media spectacle. The prosecution portrayed him as a cold-blooded killer. They said he was a con man who had fooled the literary elite with his writing. They argued that he was a violent predator who could not be trusted in society. Abbott's defense was more complex. His lawyers, with help from Norman Mailer, argued that he was a victim of the prison system. They claimed he was suffering from a psychological condition born of his time in solitary confinement. He was unable to function in the real world. He had overreacted to a perceived threat. He had not intended to kill Richard Aden. The jury had to decide. Was he a murderer, or was he a man broken by a brutal system? They found him guilty of manslaughter, not murder. This meant they believed he had not planned to kill Aden, but had acted recklessly. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The cage door slammed shut once more. This time, it was unlikely to ever open again. He was sent back to the world he knew best. He was no longer a literary celebrity. He was just another inmate. He was Jack Henry Abbott, convict, number 87 of 6113. He spent the rest of his life behind bars. He continued to write. He published another book, My Return, but it did not have the same impact as his first. The world was no longer listening. He filed lawsuits. He fought with the prison authorities. He spent more time in solitary confinement. The years passed. His health declined. The hope that had flickered so brightly in 1981 was gone. On February 10, 2002, at the age of 58, Jack Henry Abbott was found dead in his cell. He had used a bedsheet and a shoelace to hang himself. The state-raised man had finally found his own way out. What is the legacy of Jack Henry Abbott? It is a story of two men trapped in one body. There was the writer, a man of incredible talent and insight, and there was the criminal, a man of violence and rage. It is impossible to separate them. They were born of the same fire, the same difficult childhood, the same brutal life in prison. His life forces us to ask difficult questions. Can art save a man? Can a person who does terrible things also create things of beauty and truth? His story gives no easy answers. His book, In the Belly of the Beast, remains a powerful piece of literature. It is a vital document. It gives a voice to the millions who have been lost in the American prison system. It is a raw and honest look at a world that most of us will never see. For this, he deserves to be remembered. He took his own suffering and transformed it into art. He opened a window into a dark room and forced the world to look inside. His talent was real. His contribution to literature in this one specific way is undeniable. He was a writer of rare and terrible power. But we cannot forget Richard Aden. He was a young man with a future. He was a husband, He was a son. He was killed for no reason. His death was not a literary metaphor. It was a real and brutal end to a promising life. The pain of his loss is also part of Abbott's legacy. No amount of literary talent can erase that fact. The people who championed Abbott, who believed in his redemption, were forced to confront a terrible truth. Sometimes the beast cannot be tamed. Sometimes the damage is too deep. So, was he a genius or a criminal? He was both. That is the tragedy of his story. He was a man of great intelligence who was shaped by a violent world. He was a gifted writer who could not escape the demons of his past. His life is a cautionary tale. It is a story about the power of art and the limits of that power. It is about the failure of a system to rehabilitate and the human cost of that failure. The ghost of Jack Abbott lingers, a complicated and troubling figure, forever caught between the brilliance of his words and the darkness of his deeds.